And we are live. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us back probably at the library. Today, we have authors Rose Servitova, who is no stranger. She's been on here before. And we have Mark Brownlow, who I'm super excited to be chatting with finally, not over email, actually in person. I was going to say like the old-fashioned way because email feels old-fashioned now because everyone's like, you know, in your chats and whatever app you're using and whatnot. So Rose has written The Watsons, The Completing of, and she has The Longbourn Letters, which feature letters between Mr. Bennet and Mr. Collins. It's fantastic. And Mark, you have more books than I have read, but The Longbourn Letters. Oh yes, you have Rose's book, and I have them up here, but it cut it off. Then Mark has his series, which is following Mr. Bennet. Let me see. We have Cake and Courtship is the first one, and then Port and Proposals is the second one. And I know you have a list of other books that you have written that you can check out from Mark. But today, I thought it would be fun to focus on Mr. Bennet. I have very strong feelings on Mr. Bennet, and both of you won me over. So congratulations to both of you, because I am normally firmly planted in Team Mrs. Bennet. So today we'll just have some lighthearted fun, chat about Mr. Bennet, talk about some Austen things, and sip our tea, which I know, Rose, where's your giant mug? Let's see. Yes, Rose always trumps everyone with the tea larger than her head. So I thought we would start off, Rose, if you want to give us your answer first. What is sort of your backstory of Mr. Bennet in your mind of how he kind of came to be before we see him in Pride and Prejudice? And what are you thinking when you're writing your books about him?
Thanks, Melissa. Well, firstly, I'd like to say, I suppose, Mr. Bennet. Yeah, I never thought anyone had an alternative opinion to mine. Like I was actually quite surprised after my book was published that there was a Camp Mrs. Bennet and that. I just had assumed we had all jumped on board, you know, where we stood with Mr. Bennet. And I was quite surprised to find there was alternative views. But I suppose I was very taken by him because of his wit and that. And I thought there was a lot of Jane Austen herself planted in him. And also, like from her letters and that, we see, I know someone had posted a letter, a snippet from one of her letters where there was she's attending someone else's house for tea or something. And there's a very small party there, which she says is terrible because now we have to exert ourselves all the more. So Jane Austen herself hated this kind of, you know, being put in a small group and then you don't have, you can't kind of hide, I suppose, in that. So I think there's quite a lot of her own personality, her observations of people and that. So I suppose I had always viewed him in that way. And 1995 version was very much, you know, where I was at with it as well. And I think I had kind of felt a little sorry for him in the sense that he had married someone who, you know, even his children acknowledge the love isn't really there. But there's a lot there. There's no abandoning ship. There's no beating her or abusing her. Now, I'm sure some of what he says can be a bit unkind, but at the same time, he doesn't, you know, all his bitterness and resentment isn't aimed at her. And he doesn't become cruel because he's disappointed. He becomes philosophical and he kind of withdraws and makes peace with where he's at and what amount of happiness he can have in that. So it all amuses him. Everyone and every ridiculous situation seems to amuse him. So I think that's where I stand with him. And that's where I came to when I started writing my own book.
It's fascinating. I love how we can each read the same book and have a totally different perspective of a character. That's what makes it so unique. Mark, what was your take on Mr. Bennet and how he came to be?
It was similar at the start. It was the humor drew me in because he has a very similar sense of humor to me, I think. And also probably my dad was very similar. So my first introduction was just thinking, hey, he's a funny guy. I wonder what he would have thought of all the events going on around Pride and Prejudice. So that's where I sort of came in. And then I started to think a bit further about him. And the more I got to know him, the less I kind of liked him. In a strange, well, no, that's a bit unfair. If you look at him objectively, he's not a great dad to most of his kids. He's not an ideal husband. And yet at the same time, even knowing that, you kind of, but you still like him. And I kind of thought, well, why is that? He's not really that nice to his wife. He's not cruel, but he's not that nice. He kind of ignores his younger kids. He's let them go. He's nice kind to Elizabeth, but not really many others. And yet at the same time, he's kind of, you like him. And I thought, well, why is that? And then I thought, well, he's obviously intelligent. He's funny. He understands human behavior. That comes across. He's also capable of empathy. He shows great empathy towards Lizzie, and yeah, he has all these sort of abilities, but he sort of uses them selectively. He doesn't apply them to everyone. Less so to his wife than to Lizzie, for example. And so that kind of led me to think, well, why is that? What happened in his past to make him, as Rose said, kind of like, withdrawn and whatever happens, it's, let's not worry too much about it. Despite being, in a relatively precarious situation, the rest of the family, not him, but when he goes, the others are in a bit of trouble, and it doesn't seem to sort of bother him too much. You kind of like, yeah, it'll work out. Or if we're lucky, you'll die before me, he says to his wife, which is kind of, wow, okay. It's funny. And at the same time, it's, ooh, Yeah. So I started thinking, okay, well, we'll stick with the wit, and then we'll think about, what happened, which is where the sort of novel came about. What's going on in his past? What are his friends like? What did he do before he met Mrs. Bennet? What's he been up to? Why is he kind of relatively cynical about life? What happened? And then later on, I think towards the end of the original book, he starts to get more realistic about himself, and is there potential there for a bit of a kind of redemption for poor Mr. Bennet? And I discovered, like Rose, fairly pro Mr. I didn't realize there is some, hate is the wrong word, but there are a lot of people who really don't like him, and I can understand why, because we're sort of team Mrs. Bennet. She's really trying to fight for a future for herself and her children after Mr. Bennet goes, and she's not getting a lot of support. So I can understand I discovered as well, people say, well, I'm not going to read a book about Mr. Bennet. I don't like him, and okay. I didn't realize either, but that's kind of one of the joys of the whole Jane Austen fandom, is that we're not all the same. People come at it from different angles and have different characters who are their favorites. So it's all good. And at the end of the day, the best thing about Mr. Bennet is he has this incredible sense of humor, which is a thing where Rose and I definitely share a common sort of love of his wit.
Yeah. Yes. So my first introduction to Austen was the 95 Pride and Prejudice, and I loved Mr. Bennet. I thought he was funny and witty and all that. My view changed once I started studying more actual history of the time period, and then realizing what he was doing to his daughters by not stepping up and taking responsibility. And so as a character, I think it's easy to love Mr. Bennet for all the things that Rose said. We find him to be funny. It's a laugh at other people's expense, not at ours. We don't want him to be making the jabs at us, but it's funny when it's someone else. But when, like you said, Mark, when you really dig deep into, like, okay, how is he treating his family, like those sorts of intricacies, which is why Austen's characters are so brilliant, because here we are, like, we can have a whole discussion on a secondary character that we don't even know his first name, which that was interesting. I went back to both of your books and you both gave him a different first name. How did you decide what you were going to name Mr. Bennet? Because we never actually know in Austen's Pride and Prejudice what his name is.
Yeah, I think for myself, because he was going to be signing letters, I knew he'd have to have a first name. I mean, he couldn't sign to, personal, intimate letters to his first cousin, Mr. Collins signing William Collins and Mr. Bennet keeping it at Mr. Bennet. But I suppose I explored, there are patterns in Austen. If you look at the names, the female names, how many Emmas are there? There's Emma Watson, there's Emma Woodhouse, there's how many Marys are there? There's Mary Cosgrove, there's Mary this, Mary that. Mary, and then Anne Elliot, and there's so many names that were very common at the time, and that Jane Austen has no qualms using over and over again for her characters. So a character that's Elizabeth Bennet could become a secondary character like Elizabeth Watson, So I just was kind of trashing around with the names that are there. So there was Henry Crawford. There was other names for like her own brother's names, which was Henry as well, Henry Austen, and there's Francis, and there's lots of different names in William and these that are used in Jane Austen's. So I kind of trashed them around quite a bit, and I'd be very much going with a gut. And then I might have narrowed it down to consulted with a few very clever friends of mine, like Eileen Collins in Cork and people like that. And then I put it out on Twitter, as one does, and let and I think Facebook maybe, on the Jane Austen fan club, and put a poll and see what people were coming back with as well. And, that always is very interesting, and kind of be, because these are, there's no point putting a name like Alphonsus down if they're, no one's going to feel it's appropriate. So right. I don't know, was Henry actually my first choice, but it certainly was the one I ended up with and I was happy with then. So, yeah.
And Mark, how about you?
I was sort of, my source for names is always the at the back of the edition of Jane Austen's letters. There's a list of a biographical index. So nearly every name in my book comes from there, because then I can be pretty sure it's historically accurate, so to speak. Yeah. And I think I just picked out a few first names that might have come into question, like Henry, James, which was the final one. And then it was kind of the way it sounded to me. Mm-hmm. One, but also very few people are going to use his first name in the book, because just like in the original, it's Mr. Bennet the whole time. Right. Even his own, his family, his daughters will call him Papa, and his wife calls him Mr. Bennet or husband. So there's one important person in the book who pretty much the only one who calls him by his first name. So it had to sound good in her voice in my head. Right. And so Mr. James Bennet was how she would have kind of said his name. So it kind of fitted with her slightly disappointed, angry expression towards him in the scenes I was thinking of. So that's where that came about. But because the nature of the times, the first name doesn't appear very often. Right. And never at all in the book. Briefly thought about calling him Fitzwilliam, because that would have annoyed everybody. But no. That would be a Mr. Bennet thing to do.
Yeah.
But no. So
and that was actually something I just learned when I was preparing for this. I guess I'd never given it a thought as to how many characters in Austen's books do not have first names. So Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, there's quite a list of ones which...
Yeah, Lady Russell, Lady Russell, Lady Denham, various, yeah.
It's so interesting. I think it's changed so much over the generations. Like even growing up, you addressed your teachers as Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, and you didn't know their first name. And I remember that, you get older and then they'd say, oh, you can start calling me by my first name. And you're like, no, I can't. You're Mrs. Smith or whatever it is. And now it's so relaxed, for my son at least, aunt and uncle for a lot of people has dropped, and it's very informal now as to how we address each other. So okay, so I have a question for both of you. I'd love to hear your take on it. This is in no way meant to make light of therapy whatsoever, but I'm wondering, if you're the therapist and Mr. Bennet is coming to you, what issues do you feel that he needs to work on? So do you feel his humor is rooted in something deeper? Is it just his personality? What do you think, Mr. Bennet, if he's trying to make a character arc towards the end and improve, that he needs to work on in his life? Mark, I'll let you go first on this one.
That's an interesting approach. I think it goes back to the reason I started writing about him. I think I would want him to explore not his childhood, because that sounds very twee, but his past. Why is he, what's he kind of disappointed about? Is he disappointed about himself? Or is he disappointed about other people? Is he disappointed about the situation that he didn't sire a son? Who does he blame? Where's the, connect up the dots? Why are you obviously disappointed about something, or you're withdrawn from something? What is it that's caused that? And explore whether his reaction to that experience or disappointment is helpful for him as well. I don't know whether he's truly. You get the feeling he is kind of content sitting in the library with a book and a glass of port and not worrying about things. At the same time, because I know he's intelligent and I know he has empathy, has he just built a wall to sort of cover up for his disappointment? But as I answer the question, I think it's miraculous how we can talk about a minor character like this. It kind of speaks to the skill of Jane Austen in creating even a relatively unimportant minor character that everyone can talk about and has an idea of and an opinion about. It's not just Mr. Bennet, Mr. Collins and all the other ones, Caroline Bingley, Lydia, Mary, etc., etc. And that's kind of one of the great things about the book and Jane Austen as a whole. So yeah, I explore his what barrier has he built between disappointment and today, sort of thing. Rose.
Thank you, Mark. I actually think that I subconsciously made Mark go first, because I didn't want to answer that at all. And I just wanted to go, I agree with everything. I would have said everything Mark said there. I would actually, because, as Mark says, I can't help but feel a certain resignation in Mr. Bennet, and the way he reacts about Lydia going away. It's the hassle. He just, he wants the quiet life and all that. And, Mrs. Bennet is a grafter from the get-go. She tried to produce 5 children. She gave birth 5 times, which ain't easy. And I'm telling you, she did her best. But yeah, exactly. How much of it is how much has he moved in the direction of providing that security? He certainly doesn't go out and seek husbands. And when the only good option shows up at the beginning, well, not the only one, but Mr. Collins, he doesn't want him. So he wasn't, beggars can't be choosers. So the thing is, I do feel like, Mark, that there was a resignation there. There's a discontent, but there is a kind of a cynical way of making peace with things. But my thing would be, while all that is in the past, and that's probably where you'd have to go, he'd have to cut cords with it. He'd have to, what can make you happy in the now? And how can he make his future less kind of resigned and regretful and more optimistic, more come out of yourself a little bit, make an effort. You might have grandchildren. You might want to travel to see your daughters again. And we kind of get the impression, obviously, that he doesn't leave home for many reasons, except maybe to visit his family and that. Just, yeah, there's something rattling there. It feels like the past. You don't feel that with all her characters. And it's funny about the minor characters, just Mark's final comment there was that I was on a thing this morning, a webinar, and it was Limerick Film School, it was London Film School, actually. And it was a wonderful woman who is a development editor on various different projects and scripts and screenwriting and all that. She gave a wonderful talk, but she just mentioned it in passing that Mr. Collins is such a big character in her household. And I was thinking, Mr. Collins, I do recall counting how many words he actually has in Pride and Prejudice. There's so few. And yet, what a 3D character and what a legacy he's left, So that's my little thing there, Melissa. Finished.
I was thinking about this morning too. Like, how many times do you read a book and maybe, it's from blogging, you're reading a lot, and sometimes you can't even remember the hero or the heroine's name after you put it down for a few months. And here we're referencing every little character in, especially in Pride and Prejudice, but I feel like also in other Austen's works, because they're such a part of what makes the story a whole, how they're weaved in and out. I did see a question that I've been mulling over since last night. It was on a blog post that Elizabeth Adams, another Jane Austen fanfiction author, had, and it was questioning, do you think that Mr. Bennet was possibly a second son that wasn't planning on inheriting, and that this is just a major inconvenience to the life that he had planned? Which I thought was a brilliant question. I've never considered. I'd always just assumed like he was not happy, and he just maybe not happy, but just going through his life. But maybe this was not what he had planned at all. So Rose, if you want to talk to that a little bit, and also she asked the question of pointing out that Mrs. Bennet is not a gentleman's daughter either. And the fact that, did he do that out of some resentment from possibly, not wanting to have this life that he does now?
I love the train of thought there. So Elizabeth, well done. I never think that much. Like I said, I suppose the things that I'd be thinking about are things like, what does Mr. Collins have for breakfast? These are kind of the things that keep me up. So I actually love what she said, and actually, of course it does. There is something, and there could be several factors that that this sense of something, regret or resignation or something, it is being caused by something. We've all had it, a plan. Have you ever stood in your life and said, this is not how it was meant to be? And I've done it several times in my life. This is not what I wanted. This is not what I planned. And that huge resistance inside you, this anger, and and that's fine when you can change it. Sometimes you can change it. You have to make peace with it. You have to get on with it, or you have to change your life direction entirely. And obviously with certain social expectations and the law and everything, things were probably a lot tighter. There was no social welfare payment to fall back on. No one's going to get you out of a rut. Inheritances, situation for women, all that sort of thing. So those are brilliant points. I hadn't thought of them. I hadn't given it that much thought. But I will say one thing, that Mr. Bennet, I was thinking about this. While I do love him, actually, and Mr. Collins, I do love them dearly. It's like Poirot, or maybe if you've ever seen the crime program, it's called New Tricks. There's a character, Brian. You can love the character, just like I love Poirot, Agatha Christie's Poirot, or Brian from New Tricks, but you don't have to marry them. And I think that's how I can love them entirely, and loving them and acknowledging that I love them allows me to go in and accept them unconditionally with all their flaws, and maybe love them because of their flaws. And I actually think that was a great point of Elizabeth's, and definitely it could be that. His true love could have died before he met Mrs. Collins or Mrs. Bennet. He could have just totally lusted over Mrs. Bennet. Sounds like she was quite a stunning beauty. And maybe because he's careless about finances, maybe he didn't care. He proposed to her. Maybe it wasn't a wise option. But at that time, maybe there was only one thing on his mind. Who knows? So that's my answer anyway.
Mark, your book kind of has a little bit of a backstory that...
I really like that idea. It almost turns it on his head. You could say, rather than him being lacking responsibility, he was he was off to pursue a career as an artist, traveling around the world and making it up. And then his elder brother passes away, and he could just continue with his life, but he takes responsibility and comes back to the estate to sort of save the family estate. And we've all been reading it completely wrong the whole time. I think it's absolutely fantastic idea.
If you think of Rochester in Jane Eyre, that's exactly what happened. Rochester's brother dies and he has to come back. So it is very plausible. Yeah. And
he's kind of a little bit of resentment that he has to do it, and no one's acknowledging him for his great sacrifice.
Right. Yeah.
So that's kind of like, I think that's an absolutely fantastic idea. One other thing I just wanted to say about the minor characters is, what as well as Jane Austen's brilliance, what's helped has been the adaptations and the performances of the actors. It's almost impossible to think of Mr. Collins without thinking of the two actors that did that. Yeah, his names I can never remember actors' names, but they're always
David
in my
Bamber,
head. Yeah, David Bamber.
Bamber and Holland. What was the other chap? Tom Hollander.
Tom Hollander, yeah. So then they're in your head, and a lot of the minor characters were done by absolutely superb actors and performances. And I'm just looking at the comments coming. I was thinking the same. What does Mr. Collins have for breakfast? We all know what Mr. Collins has for
potatoes.
Boiled egg. Anyway,
so thank you, Margaret.
I came up with. I
know it's not in the original, but he's gone down in that one scene from the 2005 is now entered mythology and legend for
the potato.
That's how you recognize people who know the film. Is you just show a boiled potato,
yes.
and either they know or they don't know. Yeah, it's great.
And thank you to everyone in the comments that has said hello so far. And Barb Anderson is partway through the Longbourn Letters and looking forward to reading Mark's books too. So that is awesome. Yes, there are so many memes to be made for Austen's minor characters. That is also so true. So let's focus a little bit on comedy, shall we? Because you both write very comedic takes on Mr. Bennet, and of course, Mr. Collins has to make his way in there too, because we can't have a comedy without Mr. Collins showing up. Rose, I know you talked a bit before about how comedy is like your way of expressing yourself and kind of getting through the hard times, the good times. It's just part of who you are. Did you feel from the beginning that you wanted to write something that had a comedic take to it as part of your Austen fan fiction?
Not really, in the sense that initially, I think I've mentioned this to you before, it was to be Mr. Collins's personal diary, which was going to be a disaster in the making, as I discovered the minute I tried to write it, because it would be just one-sided, his version of everything, up on the high horse, and there was no way through it. And almost instantaneously, once I acknowledged that, and that thought had been in my head for nearly 10 years, Mr. Collins's diary, the minute I acknowledged the impossibility of it, straight away the idea of the letters came to me, that the way to show Mr. Collins in full throttle is to have his equal and opposite. Well, there's no equal, his opposite in Mr. Bennet. And that there was letters there. I kind of said to myself, hold on, actually, there's quite a few letters between them. Either we see snippets from those letters, or they're read out in full, or his daughters receive the letter and he read it out or whatever. But there was quite a few letters. And I said, it establishes their relationship, but their relationship is so, whether Mr. Bennet likes it or not, their relationship is so important to the whole family. And his Mr. Collins is to inherit, and he's also their neighbour now. He's after marrying their neighbour's daughter. He's going to be visiting, blah, blah, blah. So I knew I could continue it. And also, I didn't want it to be totally shallow. It's about, the whole book is about male relationship, the development of it, and the depth of it, and acknowledgement of it, and things like that. So for me, that was quite important. But there had to be humour. I mean, Jane Austen has so many ridiculous moments. Mr. Elton, the other, and she has good fun with the, I know she makes some of her heroes into clergymen, but she also makes the most ridiculous characters into it. And apparently had met so many in her own lifetime and mentions them in letters and stuff like that. But, Mr. Elton has a right old tipple at the Westons on Christmas Eve. And, you can just imagine, she doesn't write down, for courage, but he gets brave on the carriage ride home, and he decides to propose to Emma, and he thinks she should be delighted with herself that he's considered, and you can just imagine him having had a few and kind of, quite literally throwing himself at her, and it's just so comical. And I thought, she is slapstick. In my opinion, an awful lot of her humor is slapstick, and I found it very easy to kind of keep that way. And then when I went on to complete the Watsons, I knew the subjects were much deeper and was much more a feminist book about how women were at the time and restrictions. And and how they might be able to empower themselves or stand up for themselves or whatever it was. And yet at the same time, there was no way I could do it without having one or two characters, because you can't feel the depth unless you can get light. And, you know, something hard or difficult or horrible could happen, and the following morning on rocks Solomon Tomlinson, and just is the most ridiculous, you know, self-congratulating pompous idiot walks in the door. And that's the way literature or novels, I find, they work and play with your emotions and that. So there's highs and lows. Humor had to be a part of it for me. Yeah. Thanks, Melissa.
How about for you?
Yeah, similar. Humor was how I came into Austen in the first place, because I watched I think the 2005, not the 1995, and I remember thinking there are really funny bits, but I imagine that the script writer must have put those in, because there's no way someone 200 years ago wrote something as funny as that. And then I thought, well, I'll have a look at the book, you know, and see how much of it was original. And in the very first couple of pages, you get Mr. Bennet's comment about, you know, the nerves and the constant companion. And so then I was like, oh my goodness, you know, that was like a shock to the face. So humor was always, and like Rose said, my goal was always to write something entertaining. I wanted people to sit down and have a good read, and at the end of it smile and think, well, I'm glad. My goal was, if someone says, I'm glad I spent a couple of hours reading that, that's success for me. At the same time, we're all sorts of human, and I didn't want to preach to anyone, but there are sort of themes in there, in the books, about ageism and attitudes to women, and in the Charlotte Collins books, which I also do a little bit about society and the less privileged. But I don't want to stuff that down people's faces. And one of the best ways with Mr. Bennet is his ironic or sarcastic or cynical comments about other people. His humor is a great way of pointing out the ridiculousness of situations or the ridiculousness of people, which I think is something also that Jane Austen did, using humor and ridiculousness to highlight, you know, people's flaws or people's foibles. So, and Mr. Bennet is just the perfect vehicle for commentating on life and society, which also brings in the first person viewpoint. When he's sitting there musing about stuff, you've got a canvas on which you can paint your views about men, or whatever, society, wine, food, anything. You can use his humor as a sort of vehicle for all sorts of things. Yeah. And plus, you know, most of the things I did before were humor stuff, so kind of a natural. I find it very hard to stay serious. When I teach, I have to warn the students beforehand. As anything I say that's not directly related to linguistic issues, take with a pinch of salt. You know, don't take it seriously. Anything that's scientific, etc., yeah, that's serious. Everything else, I'm just messing about, you know. So, but it's hard. I find it. I wanted to ask Rose, actually. Writing humor, I haven't worked out how it's done. I'm still struggling to work out where it comes from. How you do? Do you have any sort of? How do you know when something's funny when you write it?
I have to say, I didn't think anyone would actually get to see the Longboard letters. So for me, it was like, is this making me laugh? And if it is, then there's some few people out there that'll find it funny. A lot mightn't, but you know, there has to be a few who find the ridiculous as funny as I do. And I'll be honest, that's about it. I do think Austen was character driven. She doesn't huge descriptions of clothing. No, they're not there. There's no description of sunsets and sunrises and the beautiful mountains and whatever. There isn't descriptions of the curtains or the room or the sofa. She's character driven. We'll know what they think. And so therefore, if I can make up a funny character in my head, I try to imagine how they would react in a particular situation or that, you know. My problem is with the serious characters. Like, I actually struggled a little bit with my protagonists in the Watsons in making them 3D. And in order to do so, I kind of had to give them flesh them out a bit more and give them kind of hobbies and background stuff, because it's harder I just find it a little bit harder to write blander characters, dare I say. They're a little bit, they are 3D, but they're not laugh a minute. And I do find that hard. And I do think, just to get back to what Mark said a while ago about Mr. Bennet, and his observation and observing other people, and it just reminded me of that piece in his letter to him, or how he mentions to Lizzie after reading Mr. Connor's letter, like, for what do we live but to make sport for our neighbours and laugh at them in our turn. I do feel he's able to laugh at himself too, and I think he even laughs at how easily he got away with things when Darcy comes along, when he discovers afterwards that Darcy paid for everything, so now he doesn't have to pay him back, like he was going to do if it was Mr. Gardner. He's like, oh, that's grand, sure, he can afford to, lose a couple of thousand and pay off Wickham. So that's it, yeah.
And we even see, I think we end with Mr. Bennet saying that Wickham is his favorite son-in-law out of all three that he has, so he keeps his humor no matter what is happening in his life. And I do think, like, one of the interesting things about these characters is, like, you could have Team Mr. Bennet, Team Mrs. Bennet, but all of Austen's characters have these flaws, I guess you could say, but they're real people. Like, there's no perfect, even if we look at Darcy and we look at Elizabeth, the point is that they change over the story, and they never start as, like, this perfect person that just continues through and meets the love of their life. Like, yes, we all love the romance that's added in through the movies, but the point is that we see something in them, I think, that we want to mirror in ourselves. And even Mr. Bennet, for all of his jokes that he makes, when he needs to step up and go find Lydia, he does. He steps up to the plate, so he might not have been day-to-day providing, saving up that money for his daughters, but when it comes time to make sure he takes care of them, we do see him doing that. Of course, he goes back to his joking afterwards, but like I think, Rose, you said earlier, like, that's why we love them, because we see something, maybe it's relatable, or we know someone in real life that we see mirrored in them.
The uncle at the wedding, I always say we all have a few, the person you kind of pray that your seating at the wedding won't be at the same table as them, or, it might be a cousin or, a neighbor or something like that, but we all have it. And, it's what's wonderful about people is just how true to real life Austen's characters were.
I love that little saying, it's funny because it's true. I was watching a documentary on comedians and how, the funniest comedians are the ones that it might be that shock and awe, but you know the situation, someone that does that, like, that's what makes it funny. And that's what Austen obviously does so brilliantly, is we get the characters, we get the humor, we get why Mr. Bennet's living the way that he is, and we enjoy it because of it.
I would say as well, in Mr. Bennet's defense, his whole attitude of, like, let's not worry about it, things will work out. He was right. Things worked out.
That is true. Very true.
To some extent, he kind of got away with it. He was like, all the time, he's like, yeah, whatever, and then suddenly, boom, Mr. Darcy turns up, Mr. Bingley turns up, Lydia's married, question mark, but still married. So he's kind of, he can probably stand up at the end of the day. I told you, nothing to worry about.
Yeah, that's a great point. He does get the last laugh, kind of. Mrs. Bennet, for all of her worrying, things found a way to come together.
Luckily.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't live my life that way on a hope and a prayer.
No.
But I wonder if Austen kind of was making a point there too, in some way, of, with her cheekiness, that things will happen the way that they're supposed to in life.
Fate. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. Obviously, we see in all of her stories, we get the happily ever after sort of coming together, no matter what the situation is.
Although what I was thinking about this earlier, also there are the happily ever afters, but at the same time, like, the bad guys don't get punished necessarily. In sort of standard good guys rewarded, bad guys punished sort of thing, the sort of conventional approach. if you think of people like even Wickham, we may feel that the marriage isn't successful, but he's not really. He doesn't. I mean, he's got a job up north in Newcastle with a regiment. Elizabeth keeps sending him money. Willoughby may be sort of thwarted in love, but he ends up with a fairly rich situation. So there isn't that sort of. It's not a standard, bad guy gets beaten at the end, good guy gets all he wants type thing, which is also good. Yeah. And I'm actually a bigger fan of Mr. Darcy than I used to be. I used to despise him because it's really hard as a male in the period drama world, because you're always being compared to the ideal, which is Mr. My wife once said, I said to my wife, look, it's really tough being compared with Mr. Darcy and, Mr. Knightley and Colonel Brandon. And she said, it's okay. You're still an option. If those three don't materialize in her life, then I'm still there. But I think he's way ahead of his time in a way. I really like the way everyone says, he changes, but he's kind of more than that. He changes. First of all, he accepts criticism from someone who most people, I imagine, in that situation, a rich, confident man who's never been questioned in his life, probably, actually accepts criticism from this young woman, goes away, thinks about it, takes the bits that he sees, she's right. And then he changes, not necessarily with the expectation of reward. There is a little bit of that, but equally, he just changes because it's the right thing to do. And, when I look at, not to get too serious for a moment, I wrote about this the other day, when you look around in the world today and politics and things, this ability to accept criticism and change and do the right thing, not just because the opinion polls tell you, or you're going to get the girl, in quotation marks, is an amazingly, I would still claim, rare quality and an amazingly good quality. And so I've become a bit of a Darcy fan without committing to one of the representations of Darcy on screen, because that's an argument that
don't go there.
Don't go there. I've got in a lot of trouble for that. A lot of trouble for my particular preference. So I say I think they're all wonderful.
I maintain any Austen is good Austen, even if it's not the movie version for me. Any movie that gets people watching Austen is good.
Yeah.
Mark, I think you definitely, that is, I saw a discussion on this a little while back, and that is, to me at least, the part that makes all of her characters, but Darcy specifically, is just no matter what relationship, partnership that you're in, if you are growing as a person, then that is the best relationship you could possibly be in. It's just seeing someone else that wants to have growth and wants to change and wants to be a better person. And no one is perfect and you make mistakes, but that's what makes him still appealing 200 plus years later as a character. Is not the, I saw someone said that their son was reading it in high school and came home and was saying, like, there's not enough romance in the story. It's like, I think it's one of those, things you appreciate as you get older. Like, I see a lot of people saying Persuasion isn't their favorite until, they are older in life, and you having kind of that loved and lost. You also appreciate Darcy and other Austen characters once you have more life experience, which is amazing that Austen herself was fairly young writing these stories and not having gone through some of these same life experiences, but she was able to somehow write about them and convey them in such a strong way.
Just thinking there that Mr. Palmer, if we remember from Sense and Sensibility, played so well by Hugh Laurie. Like, if Mr. Bennet was richer, he is kind of a Mr. Palmer. There is a certain, cynical, sarcastic, whatever, very similar. But he's just not, obviously Mr. Bennet isn't as wealthy and etc. But, I was just thinking how sometimes Austen's characters, people said to me, actually, I was asked by, I think it was Chawton House when I was doing an interview about the Watsons, that do you think the Watsons was actually finished off in other books like Emma? Well, do you not think that the themes, that maybe Austen did that? To be honest, it never crossed my mind. As we know, all I'm thinking about is Mr. Collins's breakfast and things like that. And like here I was being asked a very philosophical and academic, and I will have to put a disclaimer that I ponder and wonder and that, but there's nothing academic going on in between my two ears. And, so, but the thing is, the Watsons in that is like, it might have been played out in others. And I just think sometimes some characters, like the hypochondriac parent, we see quite a lot because it's in the Watsons. It's also in Mr. Woodhouse. It's also in Mrs. Bennet. So sometimes I think Austen replayed characters, or there is a touch, there's an echo in Mr. Palmer, I think, of Mr. Bennet, So just sorry, a stroke of genius there while we were talking, Melissa. I had to share it with you, so.
I love that. And she's able to rewrite them in a way that you don't feel bored, or we have Mary also in Persuasion, she can't handle, like she's got every ache and pain going on when Anne comes to visit her, and but they have these like similar characteristics, but rewritten in such a new way that we don't feel like she's repeating herself whatsoever.
Absolutely.
It's just endlessly fascinating characters. I mean, you really just marvel at the genius that she was when she was writing these stories. And that I was thinking, I kind of sometimes think like, okay, who's writing something today that we're going to be talking about or not me, obviously, other people will be talking about 200 years from now. And it's interesting and to see that, it really are so few people that stand that test of time that it was this unassuming woman just writing and living with her mother and her sister and other women and just telling these stories that came to light in her mind. All right, we have a few comments here. So Margaret was saying, see the ending of Northanger Abbey. I leave it to the readers to decide, with a lot of side eye. She kind of was just leaving it up to them. Let's see if I can scroll here. Lots of space given to family relationships and money background. Would you consider these major part of character formation? Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Definitely. And I think particularly if you think specifically of Pride and Prejudice, the whole sort of plot revolves around issues of money, in a sense that if there wasn't this precarious situation, the plot wouldn't really happen. It's all about that sense of precariousness for the Mrs. Bennet and the kids, and that makes everything, that changes everything. It changes the impact of Mr. Collins' proposal and the refusal of Mr. Collins' proposal, for example. It has completely different context when you have the money situation going on in the background, and also this idea of the difference in situation between men and women. The opportunities or options for a second son, third son being very different to a daughter. You have options. You can go into a profession, you can become military or law or the church, and women is a completely different situation. That, for example, if you don't understand that, then you might think Mrs. Bennet is just a laughable character. But when you have the impact of the social and financial situations she's in, you realize, actually, I'm team Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet now, because I think she's been given a hard time when actually all she's trying to do is secure the future. And I sometimes wonder if we're a little bit too, we judge people too much on our current values as opposed to values of the time and the situation of the time. So, for example, I was thinking earlier about the proposal. Mr. Bennet's support of Elizabeth in not accepting Mr. Collins. And I mean, I think that's wonderful. And he doesn't want her to have an unhappy marriage. And that's amazing. And for the time, I wonder how readers of the time would have seen it. Some would have seen it as perhaps revolutionary, that he's more interested in her happiness than financial security. And I'm sure a lot of people thought, well, there was the chance to solve everyone's problems if she married Mr. Collins. What is he thinking? And so when you understand the sort of necessities and drivers behind it, it changes the way you perceive everything, I think. Like Rose said, I'm not an academic at all. Or I was, but in a completely different subject area, agricultural science. Not a lot of agricultural science, which is why I loved the pig in the 2005 film. Finally, something I can understand. Now I've lost my train of thought. But I've been, for example, I was listening to Devney Loza's Great Courses course. So 24 half-hour lectures, and I've spent a lot of time reading stuff. I'm a kind of enlightened amateur, you might say. And there's so much still to learn from the context, and new things about the context and how that changes how you interpret stuff. So my immediate reaction, I must read the books again, because I've got a completely new context now from learning about the social structures of the time, and even just understanding what Jane Austen meant with one simple line changes when you understand where she was coming from, or the sort of historical context. So it's like a never-ending learning experience, really.
Yeah.
God, that got serious, didn't it? Dear me.
No.
You did. You were almost like an academic there, Mark. Almost.
I'm very good at conning people into thinking I know what I'm talking about.
We got deep there. But I'll just add to that I suppose I hadn't known a huge amount about Jane Austen. Like, I knew the basics, but I came through the adaptations and the books, the novels, which I'd read probably since I was a teenager. I wrote the Longbourn Letters, and it was after the Longbourn Letters that I really delved into all the biographies and the letters and that. So the second novel I wrote, The Watsons, was deeply influenced by the fact that Jane Austen's own life were those two particular subjects Margaret brought to her attention there, family relationships and money and security. And that's why they're in every one of the novels. Everything it's just there. It's that lack of security she had in her own life, and how her family doing well was important, and how her mother approved of her brother Edward being adopted out to the Knight family when the father was hesitant. Mr. Austen, Henry Austen isn't he? He was Henry Austen.
Yeah.
As well, was he? Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah. So Henry Senior or whatever. No, was he George? He was George, I think. I don't know. I'm mixed up anyway. But anyway, Jane Austen's father was was wondering whether they should or not. And Mrs. Austen, with her clever Mrs. Bennet eyes, saw into the future and said, Mr. Austen, when you're dead and gone, we'll be able to live in a cottage on Chawton Estate, or words to that effect. And off went Edward to the Knight family. So sometimes the women had to put on these practical heads and stuff like that. So I do agree, Margaret, that a lot of space is given to the family and to the financial backgrounds in her books, because I think they were a huge preoccupation in her own life, even from where she could be creative. She was most creative when she was secure at Steventon, in the countryside where they had a living, where life seemed to be pottering on, and then again at Chawton when life had settled down for her, and not all those moving around like a nomad that she had. She wasn't particularly happy or creative as much during those periods, in my opinion, from what I read anyway. So there you go. That's my penny's worth.
That's interesting, that her creative space came from, what she was kind of portraying in her writing and how happy she was in her own situation. And obviously we know financial security for women was a huge deal, because, there was no, I'm going to go get a job. Like, you had no recourse to step back to if you didn't have family member to take care of you. Then, you're out
I
of
think a
luck
lot.
and you're trying to find a place to stay. So
Without mentioning the C word, the COVID, a lot of, sorry, I broke in there. Sorry,
no, you're fine.
I got cut off there for a second, Melissa. No, I was just cutting right across you there to make probably a very dumb point, but a lot of creative people that I know are not feeling, and myself included, hugely creative, inspired, able to write during the instability and insecurity we've had since COVID, either through our jobs, losing our jobs or being let go or working from home, or fear of the future, fear of the present, or illness or madness or whatever it is. And so therefore that was Jane Austen's thing too. She lacked the security. And, the security helps you get into a pattern where it's the front brain and the back brain, and you're the analytical brain and the creative brain, and basically you're much more relaxed, and all that common sense stuff about worries and things like that can kind of quieten down, and you get on with the creative stuff. So I'm sure that was part of it for Jane Austen, just not having to think about the bread and butter issues.
Yeah, Mark and I were just talking about that early on before you popped on to join the live, about the difficulties of being creative nowadays, and just finding the space in your head to what am I going to talk about. And for writers, I'm sure like you're not going out in these same situations to view the world and viewing other people for inspiration, and all that makes it difficult. And Austen went through the same things when she was writing, and being able to find that creative spirit. And hopping back to your point, Mark, I do think it's so fascinating. Like, you can just keep rereading these books, and the more she was writing for a contemporary audience. And I think sometimes we forget that because we're so used to, reading historical fiction, and you're kind of guided along a little bit by the authors to help you understand what you need to know about that era. Whereas, reading Austen, she's not explaining to you all these little intricacies that you need to know. So every time you learn more, and then you go back and you reread them again, it's like a whole new experience, because you just appreciate every little layer that she was throwing in there. So
absolutely, yeah, I'd agree very much with that.
I've been meaning to get to the course that you were mentioning. I've heard really great things about it.
Yeah, it's excellent. And again, it's just little things like the title, where the titles come from, and what the first line really means. And I can't remember exactly what the topic was, but when you were talking about the hypochondriacs, Devaney was also explaining, I think at the time when she was writing some of that, if I remember correctly, perhaps it was Persuasion, I'm not sure. She was actually seriously ill herself, and yet still able to mock people being ill.
I think I read that. It was Sanditon, actually, and she was,
Sanditon, right?
Yeah, she was very, very ill. And the fragment that she's written of Sanditon is an absolute pea take of people who are hypochondriacs. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's outrageous, actually, some of what she says in it. Like, some of the hypochondriacs are crazy. OTT kind of, I massaged his foot for 6 hours, and just all this bad stuff. And but yeah, that's true. She wasn't well herself, and yet this whole she was, when the mob kind of, takes on, let's all go, like these kind of habits of people to take to the waters and all this sort of thing. And there was a lot of quack medicine, and she was very amused by it all, I think.
If you haven't read that beginning of Sanditon, it is totally worth reading. It's hilarious. I really enjoy that story. I haven't read, I don't know if I'm sure there has to be someone that's finished Sanditon or has
I'm doing it at the moment, Melissa.
What's that?
That's the one that I'm supposed to be writing that I'm avoiding writing. I'm finishing Sanditon, or I'm attempting to. So there you go.
Get to it, Rose.
I'll get to it straight away. No problem.
Well, if any of you have not grabbed Rose or Mark's books, I highly recommend them. They are amazing. And one of the things that I so enjoy about fan fiction is just sort of the butterfly effect that, you know, you guys as authors take one little piece of the puzzle and give it a spin and create a whole new story out of it with characters that we all love and enjoy. And it's really been my comfort read. I discovered it at the beginning of the pandemic, didn't even know that such things existed, but I'd been an Austen fan, and it was like, this just feels like comforting to revisit these characters and enjoy new takes on them all the time. So thank you to both of you so much for taking the time to be here.
Well, thank you so much for having us, Melissa. It's been a lot of fun. I have to say, I've enjoyed it immensely. It's always good to talk.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks, Mark. And it's just funny, Melissa, I was just as you were talking, this idea of Mr. Collins's Guide to the Pandemic came into my I think I might park Sanditon and just write Mr. Collins's Guide to the Pandemic. I could just get a bestseller overnight. Yeah,
that needs to be your next newsletter.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And now I just thought Mr. Collins's cookbook. His breakfast, Mr. Collins's breakfast table, or something like that. Yeah,
it would be like 10 ways to make potatoes.
10 ways to make potatoes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for
the audience. Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone that joined us live. And if you're catching this afterwards, thank you so much. Feel free to still leave some comments, and we will check back in if anyone has any questions or comments that you want to leave. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. We'll see you guys all later. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.